Hi, I'm Jess, part-time Hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about Tolkien. It has been a little while since I did a video in this series, but I am super excited to get into it today because I have a ton of stuff to talk about. But before I begin, I do want to make it clear that I am by no means an expert in armor, which is pretty funny because I'm going to be talking about armor a lot in this video. I'm going to do the absolute best that I can with the power of Google at my right hand, but I am probably going to get a couple of things wrong, so if you do have the right answers, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Without any further ado, let us talk about the human costumes in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, unfortunately, Tolkien provides very little context for what the humans were wearing in the books. He mentions clothing colors and occasionally types of armor, but for the most part, the designers of Peter Jackson's trilogy really didn't have a lot to go off on. Instead, they used what Tolkien did provide, a rich cultural context for each of the different groups of humans. They fleshed out the worlds of Rohan and Gondor in every aspect of visual design, pulling in the design ideas, imagery, and motifs of the cultures that Tolkien referenced. Because of this, barring the hobbits, which I did a previous video on if you want to check it out, the human costumes are the ones that are most rooted in historical reality. Neela Dixon, Richard Taylor, and Peter Jackson pulled from an incredibly wide swath of history from the 5th century CE all the way up to around the 1500s. This is a period of at least 1,000 years, and within those 1,000 years, there were a lot of different fashion trends. So the team took bits and pieces from everywhere and every when in order to create the human costumes. This makes it a little bit trickier for me personally to pull these costumes apart, but it may have worked in the designer's favor in the long run. The reality is that the average person has no idea what people actually wore in the medieval era. We've cobbled together a sort of vague cultural consciousness of what they supposedly wear, usually involving front-lacing corsets and crushed velvet and weird hats, but I probably don't have to tell you that a lot of that isn't rooted in reality. The trilogy's design team managed to find a nice middle ground between people's notions of historical dress and actual historical dress. It created costumes that were grounded somewhat in reality and practicality, but also have a feeling of fantasy to them. So although none of these costumes are historical replicas, the designers used historical inspiration to enrich their characters, story, and world. One of the main stories that the costume tells is a war of cultures. Having two groups of humans floating around Middle-earth could have very easily become confusing for the average viewer. It was necessary to create clear visual signals for Rohan and Gondor that would allow us to tell them apart at a glance, and the brunt of this weight fell onto their clothing. Rohan utilized a much warmer color palette, dwelling in reds and golds, and much of its aesthetic is inspired by Anglo-Saxon and Viking culture. They focused the fashion on the earlier half of the medieval period, which was definitely in line with Tolkien's original vision for Rohan. One of the most striking and direct historical references can be found in the helmets of the Rohirrim, which resemble the helmets from Sutton Hoo. Sutton Hoo is an early medieval cemetery that was found in England. It was an almost entirely untouched ship burial containing thousands-year-old treasure. The artifacts found at Sutton Hoo are some of the best and only examples that we have of Anglo-Saxon art and culture, and one of the most impactful discoveries made was this helmet. It was completely fallen apart in pieces when it was first found, but archaeologists were able to piece it back together to reveal this absolutely stunning work of art. And this helmet, as well as some of the other jewelry and artifacts found at Sutton Hoo, were clearly an inspiration for the creators of Middle-earth. Elements like the style and shape of the helmet carried over, as well as the use of these Celtic knot-like designs as an accent. The fashion, and particularly the armor of Rohan, is also incredibly eclectic. No two sets of armor are the same, and this feeds into the idea of them being a scattered, disparate people, only loosely governed. Most of their armor does contain some amount of scale mail, though, which I do have a problem with. You see, scale mail looks pretty nice, but it was actually a really bad choice specifically for people on horseback. The scales overlap downwards, like like this. And that leaves them incredibly vulnerable to an upward strike, such as you might get when you're attacking someone on horseback. Because of this, chainmail would have been a much more practical choice. It's also cheaper and faster and easier to produce. However, I think that last point is also probably why they went with scale mail instead of chainmail. Scale requires more skill and more time to maintain. It belies a level of personal care and attention to one's armor that you wouldn't really get with kind of off-the-rack chainmail. And for a group of ragtag soldiers that were each tasked with procuring and caring for their own set of armor, I can see why the designers made the choice. Though I may have my personal problems with Rohan's armor, Theoden's is really a standout. Though it has some scale, it is notably one of the only sets we see that has leather armor. Now, leather armor has a kind of bad rap in fantasy, which is honestly pretty fair considering that, you know, some of it is yeah. But the particular type of leather armor that Theoden is wearing does have some historical precedence. His breastplate appears to be boiled leather, which also has a fancier French name that I will put here because I am too scared to try and pronounce it myself. Boiled leather armor was, well, leather that was boiled and waxed and given other treatments so that it could hold a stiff shape and protect the wearer from some attacks. It definitely doesn't hold a candle to the kind of protection you can get from metal, but it was much more lightweight than metal options. Theoden's armor is also in these kind of armadillo-like horizontal segments, which would have greatly increased his flexibility. Beyond practicality, the leather armor allows for all of this delicate and intricate tooling, which is filled in by this lovely, rich gold color. Theoden's entire battle ensemble is rife with details, from flower patterns on the bindings to boars engraved in the belt buckles. The near obsessive details speak to the cultural importance of these items and the care that has been put into them. Theoden clothes himself in the culture of his people, vital, fiery, and bright as he charges into battle. However, when we first see him, he is neither fiery nor vital. Perched on his lonely throne, ensconced in the wicked lies of Grima Wormtongue, Theoden is a shell of a man. The color has been completely washed out of him, and he is cocooned in a mass of matted furs, a layer of rancid corruption separating him from his people. However, when Gandalf arrives, he sloughs all of this off, and we see Theoden as he really is, in rich, vibrant velvets emblazoned with the symbols and jewels of his culture. His silhouette itself is fairly historically ambiguous, maybe like 11th or 12th century inspired, but most of the style of his clothing comes from the ornamentation, where we see the repeating of these Celtic knot-like intricate Anglo-Saxon designs. We see more historical dress being represented in his niece Eowyn. Eowyn's style moves up past Anglo-Saxon and Viking fashion, more into what we would consider medieval women's fashion. This is characterized by a garment called, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, a bliau. The bliau was a gown popular for both men and women throughout the 12th century across Europe. It's characterized by long, drooping sleeves and a very fitted bodice. Most of Eowyn's dresses follow this general structure with some nods to earlier historical references. Her dresses when she's working or out on the road in particular, where we see a white underdress and a rougher overdress, seem to kind of playfully reference Viking fashion, where you would typically see a linen underdress and then a rough smock over it. Even her more elegant gowns never stray into excess. Neela Dixon wanted to express Eowyn's royal heritage but maintain simplicity, and she did this with simple overall designs and materials but little kicks of rich detail. Eowyn's eponymous white gown is fairly detailless, made from a plain white wool. The details come in on the neckline and the belt, where we get to see these touches of metallic thread and the Anglo-Saxon-inspired patterns. Most of her gowns are light in both color and material. This, paired with her lack of ornamentation, implies a sort of humble, simple grace. She may be royalty, but she seems not to care for the intricacies of dress and fashion. The only time we see her in more ornate gowns is when she is in a state of grief, when Theodred returns grievously injured, and at his funeral. These two gowns are made from a thick velvet with metallic details, and there's really just a lot of weight to them. Especially compared to her other clothing, these gowns serve as a visceral reminder to the audience of the state that she's in. Although her costumes pull from a slightly later period than many of her male counterparts, all of the costumes of Rohan read as early medieval even to an untrained eye. The designers used decorative motifs, materials, and just overarching design to tell the story of a civilization with one foot set in the past. I see Rohan as a celebration of this early medieval period, and I think that's incredibly important. Let's briefly go back to the discoveries made at Sutton Hoo. This site was important for many reasons, but one of the primary ones is that it cast light onto a period that for a long time was known as the Dark Ages. Because it followed the fall of Rome, this early medieval period is historically looked down upon and seen as the decline of civilization. This is an incredibly outdated and reductive idea, and fortunately it is being phased out of many academic circles. Certainly, after the fall of the Roman Empire, literacy was reduced across all of Europe, and we don't have many written records of major cultural events happening in this era, but that doesn't mean that they weren't happening. Sutton Hoo is an incredible lens into this foggy and ambiguous time that reminds us that humans have always innovated and created beautiful art, whether or not there were scholars around to record it. And in my mind, Rohan is a celebration of this lost and often looked down upon culture. It reconstructs a vision of this time from the scattered pieces of history and asks the question, what if we had been able to see these warriors buried in these mounds in their golden days? Gondor, on the other hand, draws inspiration from the later medieval period, and in many ways acts as a cultural counterpoint to Rohan. Rather than the mishmash of armor styles that we see in Rohan, Gondor's soldiers are strictly uniform. Compared to the pieced together and highly detailed and artistic helmets of Rohan, Gondor's helmets are of a much later style, made from one singular piece of solid metal. And Gondor utilizes plate and chainmail rather than scale. Plate mail definitely has its weaknesses. It is incapable of protecting more flexible areas like the backs of knees or elbows, but Gondorian soldiers are supplemented with chainmail in order to protect these more vulnerable areas. Because of this, their reduced flexibility isn't really a concern. After all, a tank doesn't need to know how to do a cartwheel. The Gondorians also do integrate cultural motifs into their armor, but it is in a much more polished way. All of their chest plates are engraved with the white tree design, and they have wings emblazoned on their helmets. But these designs are clearly mass-produced from a die or a massive stamp, rather than the intricate hand tooling that we see in Rohan. The effect produced is much more of an army of faceless stormtroopers, rather than this rough and tumble gang of bandits charging into battle. However, Boromir and Faramir are kind of at odds with the primary styling of Gondor's army. Boromir's color palette leans towards the warm, accented with luxurious velvet elements. He doesn't don a stiff breastplate, but rather a chainmail shirt. It speaks of both wealth and somewhat arrogant confidence. He acknowledges that he's royalty, but he does not want to conform to being just another faceless soldier. Faramir is an even more stripped down version of the Gondorian soldier. He doesn't don velvet, chain, or plate, instead donning a soft leather or suede jerkin. He does not forget his heritage though, as evidenced by the white tree on his chest. Faramir acknowledges his heritage, but seems to reinterpret it in order to better serve him and his role in the world. But at the peak of royalty is their father, Denethor, who acts as a gaudy representation of everything that is foul within Gondor's high society. He wears a chainmail shirt at all times as a cruel parody to the soldiers that he rules, and drapes himself in black furs, establishing his wealth in the most extravagant and over-the-top way possible. This is also reminiscent of Theoden's first costume, as they're both encased in fur, suffocating under the grip of the enemy's messages. Only we never get to see Denethor shake off these chains. Indeed, they are with him to the very end, accelerating his incineration as he hurls himself towards a fiery death. Unfortunately, we don't get to see many Gondorian women, but those that I do notice in the crowd seem to be in roughly 15th century garb. At the very least, it's more contemporary than Éowyn, with higher waistlines and more of a structured silhouette. All of the looks in Gondor kind of ride the line into Renaissance fashion, which is entirely fitting for Gondor. Rather than relishing in the history of the early medieval period, Gondor is ready to spring into a new era. The more developed fashion, clothes, and armor that we see in Gondor subtly cue the audience to see them as more contemporary than Rohan. We have one last character to talk about who sits delightfully at the center of all these cultural ideas, and that is Aragorn. This must have been an incredibly difficult costume to tackle, as Aragorn himself belongs to all of these cultures and none of them. You can't dress him like an elf, or a man, like a Rohirrim, or a Gondorian foot soldier. He had to take bits and pieces from all of these cultures and make them his own. And luckily, Neela Dixon and Viggo Mortensen succeeded with this costume by a long shot. And a lot of this is likely due to the influence of Viggo Mortensen, who was apparently very hands-on in the process of developing his costume. He was dead set on making sure that the costume was comfortable and practical on top of being visually appealing. Aragorn's costume consists of many different layers, all of which have been obviously and visibly hand-mended again and again. Though it's not really based on any specific historical era, Neela Dixon infused it with what she calls medieval ideas, such as his sleeves, which are made to be easily removable and reattached. This was popular throughout the medieval era, especially for outerwear. You could take the sleeves off for warmer weather and then just stitch them back on for colder weather, and it made a garment a lot more versatile. Though Aragorn's clothing is rough and practical, there are a few extra details added to expand the breadth of his story. His undershirt, for example, has a detailed embroidered design on the sleeve, as if to imply that he has been given regal gifts in the past. I think it is also important to note that when we first meet him, Aragorn is not wearing any armor. At first, he is not trying to be any kind of a warrior. He is a ranger, a hunter, and his costume portrays that perfectly. The first time we see him out of his ranger clothing is in Rivendell for the Council of Elrond. He wears a very nice brocade shirt and a velvet tunic, but I kind of feel like he didn't really pick these clothes for himself. But still, this allows us to see a different side of Aragorn. He isn't quite dressed like a king yet, but we begin to see hints of his regal past and future. The finery of Rivendell doesn't last long though, and soon enough he's back in his ranger garb. The next costume change is subtle but incredibly important, and it is also, coincidentally, one of the many moments in the movies that will make me openly weep. After Boromir's death, and once they send him over the falls, Aragorn puts on his bracers and continues to wear them through the rest of the trilogy. This serves a dual purpose of showing us how much respect he has for his fallen comrade, as well as acting as the first step in his journey towards the throne of Gondor. At the Battle of Helm's Deep, he wears a borrowed chainmail shirt underneath his usual jerkin. Although the armor is simple and rough, it shows that Aragorn is no longer just the ranger or the hunter. The costume is a visual symbol of the change that is beginning to take place. His next costume change finally places him amongst royalty as he rides up to the Black Gates. He does still maintain some of his roguishness and cultural ambiguity by wearing chainmail and a leather shirt rather than the stiff breastplate of Gondor. Still, he integrates some elements of his new culture, such as the White Tree of Gondor on his chest, and and some metallic elements on his pauldron. This costume captures him perfectly mid-transformation, poised to assume his true form. And finally, we see Aragorn as the king at his coronation. He is dressed in the best finery of Gondor, including a beautiful metal breastplate engraved with the White Tree of Gondor and 7 stars, fine detailed chainmail, and a beautiful tailored velvet cloak. The ranger is officially gone, and the king has taken his place, and this costume exemplifies the transformation. The real brilliance of the Lord of the Rings costume design is the way that they establish specific design languages for each of the cultures. But they take it a step beyond that. They so beautifully and clearly cement these ideas in the audience's mind so that in the same breath they can create characters like Aragorn, who break these cultural conventions. They establish precedents and then break them in a way that is never muddled or confusing. And the human costumes exemplify their ability to take historical elements and integrate them fully into the fantasy of the world. Rather than following into the well-worn trap of choosing historical elements seemingly at random, which are they used the historical context and the audience's knowledge of history to their benefit, creating a beautiful infusion of real and fantastical history. I've definitely said it in every video in this series, but these costumes are just such a masterclass on a completely different level to anything being made right now. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Was I able to illuminate anything new for you? What kind of stuff did I miss? Without fail, someone posts a comment that like completely makes me reevaluate everything that I just said in this video, and that's what I love to see. So make sure you comment on this video because I really like to read them. Speaking of sharing your thoughts, I am currently working on my schedule for the new year, and I really want to make videos that you guys want to watch. So I have created a Google form that will be linked in the description of every single one of my videos. So if ever you have a video idea from now and forever, please do share it with me because I would love to make it. And thank you all so much for doing that. Give this video a like if you learned something new, and be sure to subscribe because I make videos every week. And I don't know, I think they're pretty rad. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope that you all have a very happy, hobbity day.